Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. The Dunkley by-election, of course, on Saturday. Today too, federal parliament resumed with more bad news for Labor's primary vote in the latest Newspoll. And in the fact that at a time when cost of living is biting, the PM's weekend of celebrity concerts, private jets and fancy hotels makes him look dangerously out of touch. Ideology continues to trump reality when it comes to nuclear power in this country, with new polling showing the majority back a move to small-scale nuclear power. And yet Labor shows no sign of even allowing the debate. Plus, you won't believe the comments from Andrew Forrest today. I'll show you those a little bit later. Plus, speaking of energy madness, has John Pesutto put the final nail in his coffin by backing Labor's new massive green energy targets, despite industry-wide concern that they can't be met. It certainly fired up his Liberal colleagues and the base, and not in a good way. And what will it take for the authorities to get serious about rising hate on our streets with martyrdom and jihad in the name of Palestine openly celebrated in the middle of Melbourne's CBD?
How are you going to defeat us when we wish our mothers has the martyr in her house?
But first, Australia's energy insanity is going from bad to worse at the very time when households are finding it harder and harder to make ends meet. Less than a fortnight after 1.5 million plus Victorian homes and businesses were blacked out, partly because wind and solar power couldn't ramp up when a weather event triggered a power outage, the Victorian government has just passed legislation through the state's lower house to move to 95% renewable power by 2035. And for a state that's built its prosperity on cheap and reliable power of coal and gas, it will now have to completely transform its grid, all within about a decade, from one where 60% of Victoria's power is generated by coal to one where 95% is wind and solar. Even though we need power 24/7, not just when the wind blows and the sun shines. And even though there's not the slightest bit of evidence that the state could import all the Chinese wind turbines and solar panels needed in that time, or roll out transmission lines to connect it all up. And that's before you consider whether it could even be adequately firmed if actually built. The Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, estimates that Australia needs to have around 57 gigawatts of renewable generation installed by 2030 to meet all the current targets. And that means more than tripling now our existing capacity. And that's before we consider that latest madness, the green dream, out of Victoria. The Federal Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, has previously admitted that Labor's current target requires the installation of 22,000 solar panels every single day, 40 large wind turbines every single month, plus the construction of at least 10,000 kilometres of new transmission lines by 2030. Now, as you know, nothing like this is happening. But the biggest coal-fired power station in the country is set to shut down next year, then the second biggest about 3 years later than that. Around the world, countries that went down the renewables path and sacrificed coal and gas, well, they're fast winding that back. Many, as you know, are moving in the direction of nuclear power as well. But here at home, Labor still pretends it can meet pie-in-the-sky targets because it's in a fight with the Greens for the left-leaning voter. Now, it doesn't matter what the reality is. It doesn't matter that your power bill is crippling your family's budget, or that the Prime Minister's promise to cut your power bill by $275 a year is now meaningless. You are hurting. And that's before Labor comes after the car you drive and the meat on your plate as well. But what about Labor's great hypocrisy revealed last week, where taxpayers are on the hook to the tune of $900 million plus, because the Albanese government is forced to subsidise coal-fired power generators just to keep the lights on. This, of course, is the same Labor Party that demonises coal day in, day out. As I said, madness. Magic pudding economics. We're drowning in debt to get emissions down, buying 90% of our wind turbines and solar panels from China, while they burn our coal and increase their emissions year on year. But as bad as Labor is, it's the Victorian Liberal opposition that deserves condemnation tonight. And that's because when the Victorian Labor Party, the government, rammed its new 95% renewables target through the Parliament's lower house late last Thursday night, well, the Victorian Liberals just waved it through. Absolutely passed it over. It was not opposed in any way by the Victorian linos. Liberals in name only. So much for John Pesutto's hollow words about sticking up for households and businesses hit by the state's power blackouts just days before. So much for saying that Victorian Liberals were on the side of families battling cost of living. What absolutely weak surrender monkeys these lino MPs are. Is it any wonder they're almost in permanent opposition? And if you're not in Victoria, though, don't think this isn't coming to a state near you. Because, pardon the pun, my home state is the canary in the coal mine when it comes to electricity. Now, like me, I doubt you'd be surprised by news that rampant anti-Semitism has become so emboldened that jihadi language is now boldly chanted on the streets of Melbourne. And jihad means that it's not just the Jews that now live with fear, but every Australian who believes in peace and our way of life. Now, as we've seen ever since the October 7 atrocities, our public spaces have been routinely overrun by people displaying the world's oldest prejudice.
Oh, Muslim, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him.
And celebrating the slaughter of innocent women and children in the name of warped religion.
To the invading Jews we say, by Allah, the day you will be kicked out of Palestine is coming. The trees will speak, the stone will speak, and they'll say, oh Muslim, oh believer, there is a Yahudi behind me, come and kill him.
This has to be a spark to the Ummah, and a spark to the final solution. To unite the Muslim world under one leader, the Khalifa, the Imam, the Sultan.
Well, there was more of that in Melbourne last week and a protest outside the town hall. Only this time, the spectre of jihad was spoken about openly and public. Not contained to a fiery speech in a Sydney mosque, but brazenly shouted out on the streets of an Australian city. Here's the leader of the group explaining that Muslims, at least in his view, exalt the mothers of suicide bombers and wish that their own mothers were the mothers of so-called martyrs.
There is something very nice we say in Palestine Arabic. It's great. Every single martyr died, they go to their houses with a sweet. And they shout to his mother, said, you are very lucky, I wish my mom in your place. How are you going to defeat us? When we wish our mothers has the martyr in her house.
Apparently, according to what was reported exclusively in The Australian, Victorian police simply stood by while all of this was happening. Yet if praising anti-Jewish religious terrorism is not hate speech, then what is? As if celebrating martyrdom and jihad shouldn't worry every peace-loving Australian. As someone who's worked in the immigration portfolio and had plenty of security briefings about Islamic terrorism in the past, I remain deeply concerned about the way the Albanese government is processing visa applications out of Gaza. Deeply concerned about the number of people claiming Palestinian citizenship, granted visas in near record time, and the inability of our intelligence agencies to vet any of them adequately. Because once here, anyone on a visitor visa can simply use our system to apply for refugee status and remain, at least until their claim is assessed, and that can take years and years. Now, Australia is a generous country, and that should remain. But let's not mistake generosity for stupidity. Let's not allow people to come here without proper vetting, lest we find out too late that they sympathise with terrorism, or worse, have jihad in their hearts. As the journalist Paul Kelly observed in the media last week, Labor and the broader left have huge issues to confront here, given how strong the pro-Arab, anti-Israeli vote is in their electorates, in their party branches, even within their factions in Canberra. Now, of course, Muslim spokesmen, and it's almost always men, isn't it? We rarely hear from women leaders. Well, they insist that Islam is a religion of peace. But throwing around taunts about martyrs and jihad on the streets of Melbourne, well, that's not my version of peace, nor is it that of any Australian worthy of the name. As I said, Parliament back today for a sitting week, House and Senate. Let's go there now to Canberra for the headlines. Sky News senior political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
Parliament's back and the Albanese government's tax cut changes are on track to pass the Senate this week.
Labor has the numbers to overhaul the legislated Stage 3 tax plan. The coalition will vote in favour despite lashing the broken promise.
Who will ever believe this Prime Minister when he makes you a promise again?
Still complain about it whilst they didn't vote against it. The fact is that this is good policy.
In question time, the coalition targets the impacts of migration ahead of the Dunkley by-election.
The government has allowed 500,000 people in during a cost of living crisis.
And the government's new vehicle emissions standards.
Industry analysis shows the popular family SUV, the Toyota RAV4, will be taxed up to an extra $11,000 on every sale.
Here we go again. You cannot believe a single thing these chicken littles of Australian politics say.
Labor facing a fight over its election promise to introduce a housing Help to Buy scheme.
The policy would help 10,000 buyers a year, the government taking an equity stake in the home of up to 40%, the buyer only needing a 2% deposit. The coalition, though, won't support it.
So if this pathetic policy, a year and a half late, is the only thing that Labor can point to, then I think they really, really have left Australians behind.
It puts the Greens in the box seat. Adam Bandt has revealed his party will oppose the bill in the House and then in the Senate demand rent price caps, a crackdown on negative gearing and capital gains discounts.
Well, the ball is in Labor's court.
And Barnaby Joyce, a notable absence here from Parliament this week.
Nationals leader David Littleproud confirmed the Nationals MP took the week off after being filmed earlier this month lying on a Canberra street after mixing booze and medicine.
He won't be here this week. He's notified me that he won't be coming to pub. He's having the week off, which we gave him the opportunity to undertake with his family, and I respect that.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, let's get across those headlines now. National editor for The Australian, Dennis Shanahan. Well, welcome, Dennis. That latest Resolve poll shows the coalition pulling significantly ahead of Labor for the first time since the election. Labor continuing that downward trend. The coalition in primary vote terms too in today's Newspoll. It's doing well, support flatlining in two-party preferred terms. This is despite all of those so-called wins for Labor, the tax cuts, the supermarket inquiries, the workplace relations reforms, all of those supposed to turn the tide for them. Now, topping it all off, I think here, perception's everything. The Prime Minister was spotted in the crowd at Taylor Swift on Friday night. He then got on his jet, came down to Melbourne for the dinner with the billionaire Anthony Pratt and that private show by singer Katy Perry. Now, perception is reality, as I said. I don't begrudge a PM to go to that industry grocery event with Pratt. He certainly doesn't control who the billionaire invites along to sing, but I tell you what, I'm assuming it's a freebie. He didn't have to take the tickets to Taylor Swift. That wasn't an industry dinner. And all of this sort of adds up in the minds of families doing it tough, doesn't it?
Well, the Prime Minister is constantly trying to appeal to the younger voters. That's one of his keys. He wants to hold on to younger voters. And so he constantly talks about being DJ Albo. He goes on FM radio, does very soft interviews. He talks about Toto, I should say, and Tay-Tay. So he constantly tries to appeal to the younger voters. But I think that there is a juxtaposition here which is awkward. I think that when he's campaigning in Frankston for the Dunkley by-election and talking about the cost of living and trying to help people and realising inflation is so bad, that housing is such a crisis, and yet there he is seen, dancing at the Taylor Swift concert. Look, he's entitled a bit of a go and a bit of a holiday, but Scott Morrison was entitled a bit of a holiday as well. But he paid for that, and Anthony Albanese has paid for a lot of his overseas travel, even that which wasn't on holiday. So I think there's a real image problem with the Prime Minister, and he invites forensic analysis every time he puts some of this personal life out there.
Look, Scott Morrison was at Tay too. Of course, he's not Prime Minister anymore, but he's got young daughters. The South Australian Premier, Malinowskis, he was there as well. I saw some social media. Again, he's got young daughters. But I think the Prime Minister there with an adult son, most people would be thinking, not good on you, you're at a Tay concert, but, my kids couldn't get tickets. We know everybody wanted to go. Lots of young people missed out. I think that was a dumb move, almost rubbing their noses in it, but we'll see what happens in Dunkley this weekend. It's a 6% margin. I remind people of this. It's not a normal by-election either because, of course, a very popular Labor MP died in office. There'll be some level of sympathy vote for her, although she did pass away sadly in December. But what I felt was interesting, and I picked this up today, Dennis, there is no one nation or Palmer candidate this time round. There was in 2022, there's not now. So you'd hope then that Liberal vote that tends to slide off to the others on the right side of politics might come back to the Liberal Party. I'll look for that on Saturday night. But I was down in the seat on Friday. It is Mortgage Belt Central. I mean, I think it's still Labor's to lose, but I suspect they're pretty nervous in the PMO as well. What do you think, Dennis?
Well, I think that essentially all the polls are showing, Newspoll, Freshwater, they're all showing that the tax cuts, which were deliberately introduced before the Dunkley by-election, have just been swallowed whole and haven't touched the sides. There's been no bump for the tax cuts, and I'm told by people on the ground in Dunkley that the cost of living, particularly electricity prices, are far more important than the potential for tax cuts 3 months down the track, which people were already expecting. I think that there's been a bit of a miscalculation on the impact of the tax cuts in Dunkley. I think it will be very close. And I think in the end, it's highly unlikely that Anthony Albanese will lose the seat of Dunkley. It's a 6.3% margin. If he does, then it's good night, Irene. It'll be real trouble for Labor. But it'll be about the rate of the swing. And Anthony Albanese has been talking about, the standard swing for governments at a by-election is 7%. Well, that's actually a very selective figure. That's not what it's been overall. And what he's trying to do is fit a narrative where if he can hold the seat, he can claim, that's better than average. I've done better than average. I've held on to the seat. But if there is a swing, 4 or 5%, then there is going to be nervousness in Labor ranks, and all of the spin about the size of the swing isn't going to cut it with Labor-backed benches who will be facing a federal election perhaps on smaller margins than there are in Dunkley. This is a real test for Anthony Albanese, and I don't think it's going well. Certainly all the polls are saying the tax cuts are not making a difference.
It's interesting today, there was some stuff around about wages growth, and wages growth, of course, being now the biggest driver of CPI, of inflation. This undercuts some of the claims from unions and others out there, the Greens in particular, that it was the big corporate price gouging in the supermarkets that was driving the price rises. But in that data, it mentions that average full-time wages now are above $100,000. I might just add there, just on the point of Dunkley, they're low $40,000 average incomes in Dunkley. That shows you how far Dunkley is away, that the national average is there of over 100K. But of course, if people are earning on average over $100,000, this is where bracket creep really bites for them. And the Prime Minister's $15 a week stage 3 tax cuts windfall, they're not going to see that till the 1st of July. That's just a drop in the ocean.
Yes, well, parts of Dunkley, of course, are real tiger territory for the Liberals, and they will be trying to push the whole idea of bracket creep. But interestingly, in Parliament today, what they did press was immigration. And I think that immigration is becoming a symbol. Jim Chalmers accused them of dog whistling on immigration for the Dunkley by-election. But immigration has become a symbol for people who feel squeezed. They feel squeezed by cost of living. They feel certainly in Dunkley squeezed by the cost of housing, by mortgage rates and by inflation, and they don't feel that the wage rises are yet getting through. And so I think that there's a real problem there for Labor amongst those people who, they're not high income earners at all, but they're slightly higher income earners than the rest of Dunkley.
Yeah, well, as I said, I was down there on Friday. I will watch it closely this week. Thanks as always, Dennis. Great to have your company. All right, let's go on to other issues for all the talk about renewables. There's a new Newspoll out today. This is in relation to nuclear power that shows a clear majority of Australians, this is 55%, now support the idea of small-scale nuclear reactors to replace coal-fired power. Now, surprisingly, support was highest amongst those aged 18 to 34. 65% of that demographic saying they would support such a proposal. For more, let's bring in the Australian's Environment Editor, Graham Lloyd. Well, heartening, I tell you, Graham, I was reading that poll thinking there is some common sense finally there in a poll on renewables. We've got the world's largest known deposits of uranium. We ship it for others to use. We're sending ourselves broke here, shutting down a fossil fuel power that works and banning the only form of baseload zero emissions power. I'm hoping the tide's turning.
Well, certainly the results of this Newspoll are quite significant, and particularly in the high vote among young people. There's always been a view in some sectors of the environment movement that foregoing nuclear power has been one of the great missed opportunities of recent times. And obviously young people who are focused on the environment through the prism of climate change, they're looking at the nuclear issue with fresh eyes, and they're saying it's zero emissions, it's being used in other parts of the world, it's worth giving a go. The danger for the government in this is that, they may lose what they would perceive to be their strategic advantage with young people on the climate change issue. And that would be fairly uncomfortable for them, these Newspoll results.
And I might add, no going to a Taylor Swift concert's going to claw that one back. Andrew Twiggy Forrest, as you will be aware, addressed the National Press Club today. Here's something of what he had to say.
If we swallow this new lie that we should stop the rollout of green energy and that nuclear energy will be our fairy godmother, we will be worse off again. This misinformed, unscientific, uneconomic, plucked out of the air, thin air bulldust of nuclear policies of politicians masquerading as leaders helps no one. We need a power shift from a fossil fuel dependent economy run by despots from overseas to an economy which is ours, made here, renewable energy-led economy by Australians for Australians.
So nuclear across the world is growing. There are around 60 reactors currently under construction, a further 110 in planning stages. Nuclear capacity expected to more than double by 2050. I mean, I think the issue for Twiggy there is he's backing hydro, not nuclear. If there were subsidies for nuclear, I suspect he might change his mind.
Well, I think he gave the game away there, Peter, at the end when he was sounded like a bit of a stump speech about a new industry made in Australia and what have you. And this is where Andrew Forrest is focused. Anything that happens in the nuclear space detracts attention from government and industry and financiers away from that. And he's obviously very keen not to see nuclear get a foot in.
Yes, the only horse he backs is self-interest, I have to say. Energy CEOs out today warning yet again that we're not going to meet any of these emissions targets. The projects are not being developed. They're not even in the pipeline. There are all these concerns continually, as you know, about transmission. They say coal's got to stay in the mix, and I think they're right.
Well, I think it's a growing awareness that's been around. We've discussed it over many, many months, and now it's come from the very top of the companies that are involved in this transition, that this target that has been set is not achievable. The delivery is way behind where it should be. It's running into a brick wall with the removal of the existing coal-fired generators and other things, so that there's a desperate need for some sort of stop gap. Interestingly, the attention is now turning back to coal again, to keep coal going, to put in new stuff, which mirrors in a way the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. He said, look, we're going to stick with what works as we develop stuff that can replace it, but until that's here, we're not getting rid of what we've got. The debate really should centre on gas and getting that industry there as the transitional fuel. If you look at what's happening in the US now, gas is down to $1.50. And in Australia, we've put a cap on at $12. And the mismatch there is the volumes of productions and what's available in the marketplace. If we want to utilise existing infrastructure and buy time on anything else, that's the obvious solution.
Graham, just quickly, I mean, do I smell a rat that the draft default market offer is not coming out before the Dunkley by-election? Am I being cynical there?
Well, I think there would be every reason why it would be kept from public view. There's a number of factors that will go into that decision, and it's possible that there may have been an easing in the wholesale market that will be reflected. But I think this is something that the government really doesn't want to have front and centre. I think Dennis indicated that energy prices were the hot button issue in Dunkley, and there's no good news there.
Thank you very much. That's confirmation that the Prime Minister's $275 that you're going to get off your power bill is gone for all money. All right, after the break, I'll explain why I'm so concerned about that martyrdom jihadist language the other night from Melbourne. Plus, we'll talk to someone from the UK about the outspoken Tory MP, former Home Secretary Suella Braverman's comments that, and I quote, Islamists are bullying Britain into submission. It certainly made headlines in London. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Still to come, John Pesutto's capitulation on renewable energy. Will it be the nail in his coffin? With the party's base, and a lot have called me, they are outraged by the latest move from the Victorian Liberals. But first, we all saw those disgusting scenes outside Melbourne Town Hall last week when the council, for reasons I can't understand, thought it was their place to spend 4 hours debating a motion about a ceasefire in Gaza. Thankfully, the motion was voted down, but it gets worse, with new footage showing the extent of the hate on display at that rally. All I might mention within earshot of police. One video obtained by The Australian shows a speaker celebrating martyrdom in the name of Palestine.
There is something very nice we say in Palestine Arabic. It's great. Every single martyr died. They go to their houses with a sweet. And they shout to his mother, said, you are very lucky. I wish my mom in your place. How are you going to defeat us when we wish our mothers has the martyr in her house?
Joining me now to discuss this worrying escalation, Shadow Home Affairs Minister, Senator James Paterson. Well, this is out-and-out jihadist sentiment, James Paterson, certainly to me. How concerned are you about this?
Deeply concerned, Peter, on a number of levels. Firstly, this appears to be another incitement to violence call in the community, which has not been punished. No one has been charged at state or federal level under the extensive anti-incitement provisions that we have for inciting people to commit violence. I'm deeply worried about that. But secondly, it just shows why councils have no business debating these motions at all. It brings nothing but harm to the community. It divides the community, and it is not their role. If councillors want to get involved in foreign policy, they should run for the federal parliament. And my state colleague David Southwick had a very good suggestion last week that we should cut the funding of councils that can't stick to their own knitting and stick to their own jobs. I mean, we have some councils in Melbourne, like the City of Yarra, which spends a lot of time debating foreign policy issues, but literally cannot manage to pick up the bins each week. And there is rubbish littered in the streets on a weekly basis in places like Richmond because they can't perform their basic functions. Well, frankly, I think the federal government funding that they get should be in question if they're wasting their time on foreign policy matters where they have no expertise and no business being involved.
I might add the City of Yarra too. I mean, it bills people for their rates, but it also adds loading and extra payment for people in relation to bins, which is its core business. So I don't know what they put the rest of the budget towards, but it clearly isn't their day job. Last week you copped it from Labor. The left accused you of whipping up anti-Palestinian sentiment because you were rightly concerned about the number of and pace of visas granted to people out of Gaza. I mean, that footage in Melbourne shows me, I think it shows Australians, why you were right to be concerned. Surely this is going to prompt a rethink about how we assess these applications out of Canberra.
Peter, the reason why I asked those questions is that I was very disturbed that such a large number of visas, more than 2,200, were being granted in such a short period of time, and I was unconvinced, as I know you are, that you could possibly do adequate identity or security checks in that time to verify who these people are and that they don't pose a risk to the community. Now, I expected that one day we would live with the consequences of one of these people brought in from a war zone controlled by a terrorist organisation. I didn't expect to be proven right so quickly when your colleague Shari Markson found a Hamas supporter who has come to Australia and has tweeted their support for October 7 attacks already on one of these visas, already from just a small list that she found as a journalist using a desktop research. Imagine what we would find if our security and intelligence agencies were given the proper time to adequately consider these applicants before they came here. I think you'd find a lot more than just one based on their social media activity alone. So I'm deeply concerned about the government's decision to rush these visas through, and I fear we will be paying the consequences of this for some time.
And look, I don't think anyone's got any hope that Labor's going to deport that particular individual or look through the social media of others. But talk to me about this Palestinian activist. This activist hijacked 2 planes, has labelled Hamas as freedom fighters, and they're slated to deliver the keynote address at an eco-socialism event in Perth in June. Now, the woman in question, she's 79 years of age, but in 1969 she helped hijack a TWA flight on its way from Rome to Tel Aviv, and then just a year later attempted another hijack of another aircraft. Now, unsurprisingly, James, Jewish groups in Australia are pushing for the government to deny her an entry visa. What are your thoughts?
Well, the Jewish community is right to be concerned, and I think all Australians would be horrified by the prospect that the Albanese government might grant a visa to this person who was convicted of hijacking not 1 but 2 planes and remains a member today of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a listed terrorist organisation. Now, someone convicted of terrorist offences, someone a member of a terrorist organisation, has no business whatsoever coming to this country, and the Albanese government and the Minister for Home Affairs should be able to immediately, publicly rule out the prospect that she would be welcome here under any circumstances and say that if she applies for a visa, she will not be welcome because she has been invited by an organisation that's holding a conference in Perth. She could come here if a visa is granted, and I don't think that prospect should be allowed to fester for any longer. It needs to be immediately ruled out.
Have you asked questions, or is the coalition pursuing this in Canberra?
We certainly plan to. We asked questions on other hot-button immigration issues today, like the NZYQ matter and the 2 illegal boat arrivals that have made it all the way to the Australian mainland. Unfortunately, it's a target-rich environment at the moment, Peter.
Yeah, sorry for our country there, James Paterson. Thank you for your time as always. All right, let's go to the UK, where last week the House of Commons descended into chaos after multiple amendments of a Gaza ceasefire motion were presented to the Speaker. The Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, allowed both Labor and government amendments to a Scottish National Party bill that calls for an immediate ceasefire. By doing so, he broke with long-held convention. I have to say, all hell broke loose. The PM, Rishi Sunak, has slammed the move by the Speaker, and more than 70 MPs have signed a no-confidence motion in Hoyle. For more on this, I'm joined now by the editor of Spiked Online, Tom Slater. I watched all of this over many, many hours, Tom. I mean, it was huge, and it was a big departure from convention. Just take my viewers through it step by step of how extraordinary it all was and why it created the headlines it did.
Yes, there's almost two layers to this particular circus as we saw it unfold in the House of Commons. So when Lindsay Hoyle called both this Labour and this Conservative amendment to an SNP motion, as you say, he was breaking with convention. The question is, why did he do it? So the more superficial claim, I think, is that he was lent on by the Labour Party, which is also his own party. He's bound to be impartial, but that he is a Labour MP, to call the Labour amendment to break with convention so as to save Labour's blushes, to stop many of their MPs from voting with the SNPs to demonstrate that they backed a ceasefire. Then the deeper question is why, even if he did give into that pressure, did he do so? And when he came to the House to explain himself after all of the thrills and spills and the upset within the House of Commons over this, he did so, he said, and I think genuinely, because he's concerned about the safety of MPs. He even said very explicitly the following day, I do not want to get a phone call and find out that another member of this House has been murdered by a terrorist. So even if the Labour Party did lean on Lindsay Hoyle in a way that I think is pretty plausible, I think the way in which they convinced him is still deeply chilling, in that there is clearly a terroristic threat to MPs. And we know where that's coming from. It's coming from Islamist extremists who have been riding high since October.
Yeah, there was a lot of emotion in that speech you gave the next day, and I think I agree with you. I thought it was absolutely genuine. I mean, how fearful are MPs? I mean, I was there in London when there was 100,000 plus on the street, not just pro-Palestinian, I mean, very anti-Semitic, anti-Western in their rhetoric. What's the mood around London in particular at the moment, Tom?
The mood is incredibly intense, and I think MPs have a right to be concerned. It was only a couple of years ago, in 2021, that David Amess, a Tory MP, was murdered by an Islamist terrorist because of his support for airstrikes against Islamic State. We've had a Conservative MP, Mike Freer, recently announced that he's going to step down at the next election. He represents one of the most Jewish constituencies in the country because he's been menaced with death threats for many years. We had a Labour MP in 2010, Stephen Timms, who was stabbed by an Al-Qaeda fangirl, luckily survived. And we had the 2017 terrorist attack on Westminster, which claimed the lives of 5 people, including a policeman whose job it was to protect Parliament. So this isn't made up. And what I find so dispiriting about a lot of the discussion, though, is that even Lindsay Hoyle, even our MPs, cannot summon the courage to name the threat. They talk generally about intimidation and harassment and so on. They never use the I word, Islamism. And that's clearly where it's coming from. So the fact that we can't even name the threat, I think, is deeply troubling going forward.
Well, I think this is why Suella Braverman's comments, former Home Secretary, of course, for Australians who are not sure of her, she's a current MP on the backbench. I mean, her comments didn't miss. She named the I threat. She called it Islamism. She wrote an opinion piece in The Telegraph and she said Islamists are bullying Britain into submission. Now, I know the left are rounded on her, but I suspect she's got a fair amount of support in the community, doesn't she, Tom?
I think so. I mean, in terms of the message she was putting across, whenever Suella Braverman pops up, people seem to focus so much on some of the rhetoric, which can be a bit over the top or what have you, but they miss the fundamental point that she's making, which is absolutely right, which is to say that in terms of this country, we have capitulated to Islamist intimidation time and again. We've seen that in Parliament over the past week. We've seen that with things like the Batley Grammar School teacher controversy, where Islamists rounded on and effectively pushed into hiding a teacher because he showed Muhammad cartoons. This is something that we've seen time and again. And I wish politicians would stop having kind of long rows over particular language a particular politician might have used and whether or not it was a bit overheated, and look at the fundamental issue, which is that this is a genuine threat within our midst, which our politicians, with some exceptions, feel incapable of even beginning to address.
Tom Slater, thank you for your time. All right, Australia, there it is. That's what's on our horizon if we do not wake up. After the break, why the average Australian household is being charged $1,000 more per year for the same amount of electricity as a business. Plus, Labor loves a tax. The latest, of course, is waste exports. It's nothing more than a recycling tax. More on that shortly. Welcome back. More news I want to get you across tonight. To do that, let's bring in my panel. LNP MP Keith Pitt and Senior Fellow at the Menzies Research Centre, columnist, of course, for The Australian, Nick Cater. Nick, the Victorian Liberals, I opened the show with them tonight. They supported on Thursday night, certainly through the lower house, it's passed now, an increase in Victoria's renewables target to 95% by 2035. I mean, what did they miss about almost 700,000 Victorians losing their power 10 or so days ago? It's caused a real rift inside Shadow Cabinet. I've spoken to a number of Shadow Cabinet ministers. I certainly know the Liberal base is angry. My phone lit up like a Christmas tree. I mean, are you surprised by this?
I'm extremely surprised, Peter. I mean, governments under our system, our wonderful system, have to, one, obey the law of the land. That's the Magna Carta in action. But secondly, they've got to obey the laws of physics. They can't break the laws of physics just because they want to, and that's exactly what they've done here. They cannot possibly achieve this target this way with renewables alone. I know no expert, no serious credible expert who believes they can. There is no country in the world that has got anything close to 95% renewables with just renewables. There are 9 countries that have cheaper electricity than us. 6 of them have nuclear power, and all of those 6 are closing in on close to 95% or 90% renewables. That's the only way you can do it in the end. You need baseload power, and of course, if you're worried about the carbon, you need clean energy baseload power. There's one source of that, and that's nuclear. So unless this opposition is also prepared to go to the next election with a policy that says we are going to lift the moratorium and encourage nuclear investment, then they are not a serious opposition.
Well, they're unelectable, and I don't suspect he'll be the leader by the end of the year. But I mean, this is the damage that's constantly done by these lino Liberals around the country. Keith, help me understand, why are the households of this country paying an extra $1,000 more for their power, the same amount of power than big business? Why this gap?
Well, why are big retailers charging what they can and making more profit from residences? Well, because they can. When you're looking at the big market, so big consumers, that's a very competitive tender. They've got to price in because they consume so much. It might need some specialist equipment in terms of connection and connectivity and everything else. And they bid into that market in competition with others. In the retail sector, there are so many customers. They'll set a price. In fact, in Queensland, it's regulated just to make sure the Queensland Labor government gets their share and keeps filling their coffers. But for the poor old retailer, they're always the ones that miss out. My best advice is shop around, look for a better deal where you can. But there's lots of places, particularly in Queensland, there is no competition. There is just one provider, and I think that's a great shame.
Nick, what's this tax that's coming for our recyclables now? We're told industry is saying it's on the back of government regulations. They say those government regulations on waste amount to recycling tax. Surely that's the last thing we need now.
It does seem rather counter to the narrative, doesn't it, Peter? I've been concerned for a long time about the economics of recycling. It's extremely opaque. We don't know how much is actually recycled and how much is just thrown away. We don't know what it costs us, really, because all that's hidden in various ways. I'd like more openness about it, but I think we do think that recycling is a good thing. Everybody thinks that. I mean, it's good to reuse things where we can, and you can certainly reuse cardboard as Visi do with almost all of the waste paper we recycle. And I just think that I know this government likes to tax things because whenever it can, wherever it can, but please draw a stop at this one.
Keith, last week we found out that Tony Burke, he's the Federal Minister for Jobs, about 70% of his own department work from home. Now, I can't fathom how you make work from home as a federal public servant, but there you go. Well, down in Victoria, the head, so the Secretary of Victoria's Department of Jobs, He is reported to be working from home 3 days a week. The salary is well over $600,000 a year. There's manifest complaints from his department that things are in a logjam, things aren't being done. How on earth does that happen? Now, of course, we find out too in the business pages, the value of property, so office property in the CBDs, particularly of Melbourne, well, that's plummeting because people aren't getting back to work.
Well, Peter, I'm in Canberra right now for the sittings. What am I doing here? We could all be our electorates and not come back ever.
Work from home.
Save the taxpayer a fortune. Work from home. Well, I'll tell you why we're not working from home, because this is where the job is and this is where people send us to fight for them. And 600K and 3 days at home a week, sign me up. What a great deal for some individuals. But whatever happened to productivity and the need to actually associate with your work colleagues, to be able to make joint decisions, to get good outcomes, to get outcomes for your business? And what about those individuals who are out there? You can't wire a new house from home. You can't install the plumbing. You can't do a repair on the dishwasher. It is a very limited amount that can work from home, and yet we are still spending hundreds of millions, if not billions, on new leases for the public service at a federal level, and I would assume at a state level. Well, it's got to stop. And what's next, Peter? There'll be claims for all sorts of things. You know, new chairs, tripping over, air conditioning. You'll have to have workplace inspections at home. Well, I think they already happen.
Oh, God, help us. Nick, help me understand this. Report today that moderate Liberals in New South Wales are trying to court Allegra Spender, this is the Teal in the seat of Wentworth, to join the Liberal party room. Now, yes, you want every extra seat you possibly can, but you tempt her in the party room. She's not one of the Libs. She's not one of ours. You put her in the party room, I don't imagine she'll leak, but she'd certainly be a thorn in the side in terms of the policy direction, surely.
Look, I think it doesn't seem to me to be a positive move. I mean, I welcome everybody to join the Liberal Party, naturally, but I think they're better off going in with a candidate with some strong policies that can really argue against Alexa Spender, because what she's doing is just bad for the country. I mean, the things she supports are very often bad for the country, certainly bad for working people. But the problem, Peter, is this, and I think this came out in the Voice referendum, that there were 9 coalition seats that we held in before the last election that voted yes to the referendum. We lost 8 of them. So 8 of the seats that we lost all voted yes. Now, I think that says something more broadly about the kind of people there, the way where their priorities are and what they focus on. And so we've really got to seriously look at how we can align their interests, such as they are, with those of the rest of the country, which is the vast majority of the rest of the country, as we saw with the Voice referendum.
Or the Liberal Party shouldn't turn itself teal to try and get them back. It should go and get some Labor seats out there in the real world, which would be my advice. Hey, Keith, Woolies is that trying to unwoke itself. No longer will they wear the badges that have got the little pride flag on them or the Indigenous sticker. They just want their workers to turn up wearing the white uniform, putting the stuff on the shelves and serving customers and deriving some value for shareholders. About time.
Huzzah, Peter. Finally. I've got to tell you, mate, when I'm shopping and I'm looking at someone's name tag, it's because I want to know their name. I'm not worried about their cultural connection or what their sexuality might be. I'd hope that they're not going to put the ice cream on top of the grapes. And if I'm looking for pies and I can't find them, they know where they are. And I just want them to know their job and be able to say hello and be polite to them. So this is a good move by Woolworths. I think it's the right decision. And finally, we're seeing some sense.
Spot on. I couldn't care who you sleep with on your name badge. I just don't want you to be asleep at the till or asleep at work. That's all I care about. I might even go back to Woolies now, but we will see. We will see. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. See you both next week. All right, that's it for me. Tomorrow night at 6, I'm back, but filling in for Andrew Bolt. Up next, Steve Price.